This week marks exactly 20 years since the handover of Hong Kong, and that was the culmination of the Sino-British Joint Declaration that began in 1984, that was signed on the 19th of December 1984. The handover itself was the 1st of July 1997, 20 years ago, uh, in the next few days. I've just been watching the recording of the actual handover ceremony. The important bit is 10 minutes. Very formal, but very poignant. The British flag comes down, the Chinese flag goes up. It's all peaceful, which I suppose is one of the um, taking points from it, that two major powers had a peaceful transition of power. It is a rare thing in history, so I suppose that's something that needs to be recognised. But from a British perspective, it certainly was something quite poignant. It was essentially, to all extents and purposes, the formal end of the British Empire. If we assume the British Empire began in 1757 with British victory at the Battle of Plassey, which then paved the way for dominance in India, the handover of Hong Kong was essentially the end of the Second British Empire. So, a very historic event. What I want to talk a little bit about is the actual Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984. That is very important in terms of the case I'm going to be arguing here. This is from Wikipedia, just to simplify things, and it was signed by the governments of Zhao Ziyang of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. He was premier at the time, actually the reformist premier, and Margaret Thatcher, who was British Prime Minister. It was formerly known as the Joint Declaration of the Government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the Government of the People's Republic of China on the question of Hong Kong, signed by Premier Zhao Ziyang of the People's Republic of China and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of the United Kingdom, on behalf of their respective governments on 19th of December 1984 in Beijing. The declaration entered into force with the exchange of instruments of ratification on the 27th of May 1985 and was registered by the PRC and UK governments at the UN on the 12th of June 1985. That's very important. Ratified at the United Nations. In the joint declaration, the PRC government stated that it had decided to resume the exercise of sovereignty over Hong Kong, including Hong Kong Island, Kowloon, and the New Territories, with effect from the 1st of July 1997, and the UK government declared it would hand over Hong Kong to the PRC with effect from the 1st of July 1997. The PRC government also declared its basic policies regarding Hong Kong in the document. In accordance with the one country, two systems principle agreed between the UK and the PRC, the socialist system of the PRC would not be practiced in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, abbreviated as HKSAR, and Hong Kong's previous capitalist system and its way of life would remain unchanged for a period of 50 years until 2047. The Joint Declaration provides that these basic policies should be stipulated in the Hong Kong Basic Law and that the socialist system and socialist policies shall not be practiced in the HKSAR. Now, we're now 20 years on. The ceremony was presided over by Tony Blair of the UK and Jiang Zemin of the People's Republic of China. Prince Charles was also in attendance, as was Chris Patten. Chris Patten was the last governor of Hong Kong, someone who's definitely worth listening to, a man with very interesting perspectives on this. I've got his biography, haven't started reading it yet, but I imagine that will be a very worthwhile read. So Chris Patten had a unique role in history as the last, basically, governing official of the British Empire. Um, I think it is very, very clear that since that time, China, speaking candidly, has betrayed the one country, two systems policy. And I base this on the fact that since that time, far from respecting the autonomy of Hong Kong, it's very obvious that Beijing has increasingly tried to exert communist ideological influence in Hong Kong, whether that be trying to enforce communist nationalism, in the education system, whether it be handpicking chief executives. It's very clear what Beijing is trying to do. And what they want to do is make Hong Kong another city just like mainland China, no different from Wuhan or Shenzhen or Guangzhou or any other mainland city. And this is something that anyone who believes in democracy should be concerned about. Now, one of the most interesting questions that has had surprisingly little coverage is how a conservative prime minister in the UK would have entered into such an agreement with a communist single party system. And I think the reasons are practical. In the 1980s, Britain recognized that we did not have the military capabilities to defend Hong Kong. Hong Kong itself relied on trade with Guangdong province and cities like Guangzhou and Shenzhen. I think there were practicalities that put the British government into a corner, and in some ways, they were dealt a bad hand in terms of negotiations. What Chris Patton has argued is that because they have basically let down, at least this is what he's alluded to, this wasn't his words, but this is my interpretation of it. The Sino British Joint Declaration was supposed to be in effect until 2047. Now, there are certainly things that go on in Hong Kong that would not be tolerated in the mainland. So, to that extent, the CCP is treading carefully. Xi Jinping is in Hong Kong at the moment. There's huge security presence there. They don't want protests. Clearly, they don't want Emperor Xi to be met with this sort of reception. Um, but basically, the Communist Party has betrayed its promise of autonomy because it is very clear that they have been trying to impose a communist system in place in Hong Kong. It's very clear that most Hong Kongers don't want this. I won't say everyone, I am aware that there are some pro Beijing Hong Kongers. But the protests in the so called umbrella protests 3 years ago, 2014, overwhelmingly led by young people, brought back memories of the protests of 1989. And it is good that they didn't end with a violent, bloody crackdown. But under Xi Jinping, um, the Politburo is arguably in a more powerful position than at any time since Mao's era, and that's quite something. I think there are many reasons to be very concerned about the situation at the moment. One good thing is that this movement is being driven by young people. The worst thing, the worst thing would be if there was complacency and people kind of thought, there's no point in protesting, there's no point in expressing dissent, we'll just kind of get on with life. Because that is exactly what Beijing wants. Um, I accept as a Briton that Hong Kong is no longer part of the British Empire. The British Empire is gone. It's history. What I do not accept is the arrogant way that Beijing is trying to bully the people of Hong Kong. And you see this among Chinese nationalistic comments. About 20 minutes ago, I came across a comment that typified this mindset. And the guy basically said, Hong Kongers who don't like the CCP system should get out. They should accept it or get out. And that is typical of communist bullying. It's one of many reasons I despise communism. It is fundamentally a bullying, arrogant, and subjugating system. China itself has made some significant changes since the darkest days of Mao Zedong, but it is precisely because Hong Kong wasn't part of the mainland at that time. It's precisely because it was under British jurisdiction that Hong Kong never saw the horrors mainland China did. The horrors of the Cultural Revolution, the absolute nightmare of that time. Something that shamefully the Communist Party wants to erode from history. They want to whitewash. And I think people really, really need to be on the mark in Hong Kong. They need to, any attempts, for example, at whitewashing history, at trying to instill a nationalist history into Hong Kong, for example, whitewashing all the crimes of the Communist Party, I think it is going to be very difficult to fully brainwash 7 million people. I don't think it will happen, actually. I think there'll be too many Hong Kongers will simply not accept it. So I think part of them is practical, part of their logic is practical, and they know that they cannot turn Hong Kong into a totally subservient city. But at the same time, the CCP is a fundamentally dishonest organization, party. They've been lying for 68 years about the crimes of communism. They've been whitewashing these things for 68 years. So we shouldn't be that surprised that they've betrayed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Chris Patton expresses concern that we as a nation are losing our honour by not being more outspoken on this. I think, again, part of it comes down to pragmatism. And I agree with him to an extent, but I also think he's no longer a government minister. Um, the positions that David Cameron and Theresa May are in is that because of the Great Recession, the unfortunate reality is we did rely on Chinese trade. Now, what Chris Patton has said is that trade does not necessitate pandering to a totalitarian communist system. But, and I appreciate the fact that Chris Patton is far more experienced and knowledgeable on these issues than I am, but I don't know how true that is. When we're coming out of a major recession, and I think we're still recovering from that, I think that it's very difficult to be in a position where you want trade with a major country like China, a major economy, whilst at the same time we have deep misgivings about what fundamentally is a totalitarian political system. Um, and when it comes to Hong Kong, I feel Hong Kongers feel somewhat betrayed by Britain, that we were not more outspoken. The truth is, I feel if we were overtly defensive of Hong Kongers, I don't know how much that would have helped. I do think we probably could have been a bit more outspoken. And I personally felt very uneasy when George Osborne, as Chancellor, said we're basically going to put human rights to the side. We're going to put these sort of issues to do with Chinese politics completely to the side. Unfortunately, that did seem like kowtowing to the CCP. Here's the thing, China is a very powerful country, but it's not all powerful. The CCP is in a powerful position, but they do have serious domestic challenges. So the 30 more years this joint declaration is supposed to be in effect, it's already under serious threat. I do believe that, trade or not, the British government perhaps needs to be a little bit more vocal on this and remind Beijing that they signed this declaration at the United Nations. They cannot now turn back on it and cave in on Hong Kong's promised autonomy. We accept that Hong Kong is part of China. There's nothing we can do about that. But to those Chinese nationals who are triumphalist about this and like to talk about British defeat and all the rest of it, from the British perspective, what we see is Chinese dishonesty, Chinese bullying, and Chinese subjugation of Hong Kong. So we'll leave it there. So those are just a few things I'm thinking about it this week. I feel somewhat sad, partly for patriotic reasons, for obvious reasons, but also for the people of Hong Kong, because I do think that there is a real issue going on here, and I think the biggest problem would be complacency. Now, I don't think that some of the protests were necessarily the best way forward. I don't think that blocking highways all day long and causing inconvenience for other Hong Kongers was necessarily the best way forward. But I do have a lot of respect for the courage that those young people showed, Joshua Wong and the others. Whatever you think of them, standing up to a powerful communist dictatorship unquestionably takes courage. Unquestionably. in the mainland, they would have just disappeared. So I do have profound respect for the courage those young people showed. And I do think it is a reminder of the spirit of 1989. So what does the future hold? Well, anything could happen in 30 years. Anything in other parts of Chinese hegemony as well, for example, regarding Taiwan. There's going to be a lot of things happen in the next 30 years. But I would say that if Beijing thinks that this bullying approach to world politics, this bullying approach even to domestic politics is going to work, you push people into a corner, at some point they will fight back. That's what they need to understand. I mean, we in Britain had to learn that. We had an arrogant attitude to the Indians. What happened? India got independence. So I think that by disrespecting the Sino-British Joint Declaration, what Beijing is doing is reminding the world what it fundamentally is, which is a totalitarian single-party system. And there's not really much more to say, but one good thing I take away from this is the fact that I think there is simply too many people in Hong Kong who know the truth. They know what the CCP is trying to do, and they simply will not tolerate it. Because the only way that the CCP can force them to tolerate it would be a crackdown, a bloody military crackdown, akin to 1989. And the world today is far more interconnected with the internet than it was in 1989. There was no internet in 1989. At that time, we had to rely on news reports. So I think it would be a far bigger risk for the CCP to try something like that today, a much bigger risk. And the last time they done it, what happened? They faced years of sanctions, which they deserved. So I don't think Xi Jinping is stupid enough to try that again, because I think it would backfire against China. It would be shooting themselves in the foot. It wouldn't help. It wouldn't help the situation in China. So we'll leave it there. If you're a Hong Konger, let me know your perspective. And I want to be very clear here. Some people might think, oh, this British guy just wants Hong Kong back. I'm realist. I know Hong Kong's never going to go back to Britain. I totally understand that. But I will not be silent in criticizing CCP arrogance and in betraying the people of Hong Kong and in betraying the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is what they done by increasingly trying to impose communist will in Hong Kong. And it's a disgrace. Um, Typical of communism. And this is why I frankly despise communism. I'll leave it there.